I should have looked away when the laughter started, but something about the way the glass shattered against the floor made it impossible to ignore as the sharp sound cut through the low hum of the restaurant and every head turned just for a second before pretending not to notice again, because that's what people do in places like this. They look, they judge, and then they go back to their $200 steaks like nothing ever happened while someone else becomes the evening's quiet embarrassment. And I stood there with a tray in my hands, frozen, watching red wine drip slowly down the sleeve of an old man's worn gray jacket, the fabric soaking it in like it had seen worse days than this. And maybe it had, maybe that was the strangest part, not the insult, not the laughter, but the way he didn't react, not even a flinch, not even a word, just a stillness that didn't belong in a room filled with noise and ego and polished shoes that cost more than my rent for 3 months. And I remember thinking he looked out of place, not because he was old, people his age came in sometimes, but because he didn't try to fit in. He wasn't nervous, wasn't apologetic, wasn't shrinking the way people usually do when they realize they don't belong somewhere expensive. Instead he just sat there, hands resting calmly on the table like he had chosen that exact moment to exist exactly where he was, and nothing about the situation could move him. And that made it worse somehow, because the group at the next table, the ones who had caused the spill, noticed it too. And people like that don't like being ignored, they like reactions, they feed on them. So one of them laughed louder, leaned back in his chair, and said something about how maybe the place should start checking IDs at the door to keep charity cases out. And the others joined in like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard, while the manager stood a few feet away pretending to rearrange silverware, pretending not to hear. Pretending not to choose a side even though everyone knew which side he was on, because in this place money always spoke louder than dignity. And I felt my grip tighten on the tray, my fingers aching against the polished metal as my heart started beating faster for no reason I could explain, because this wasn't my problem. I needed this job, I needed the tips, I needed to keep my head down and get through another double shift without drawing attention to myself. But then the old man reached for his napkin slowly, deliberately, and dabbed at the stain like it didn't matter, like none of it mattered. And for a second his eyes lifted, just briefly, and met mine across the room, and I swear everything else faded out. The noise, the lights, the movement, all of it gone in an instant, because there was something in that look that didn't match the scene, something steady, something sharp, something that didn't belong to someone being humiliated. And I felt it like a warning I didn't understand yet, like standing too close to a quiet storm before it breaks. And that was the moment I realized this night wasn't going to end the way anyone in that room expected. I told myself to move, to turn away, to focus on the table in front of me where a couple was waiting for their check, but my feet did not listen, because something about that moment felt unfinished, like a sentence that had been cut off halfway through and needed someone to say the rest out loud. And the laughter from the group behind him only grew louder, as if they were trying to fill the silence he refused to give them. One of them leaned forward, tapping his glass against the table with a smirk that looked practiced, the kind that came from always getting away with things. And he said something about how maybe the old man should apologize for making the place look bad. And that was when I felt it, that quiet shift inside me, small but undeniable, the kind that makes you realize you are about to do something you cannot take back. My manager caught my eye from across the room and shook his head almost imperceptibly, a warning, a reminder of rent due next week and bills stacked on my kitchen counter. But the sound of the man's voice kept echoing in my ears, and I could not pretend I did not hear it anymore. So I set the tray down slowly on the nearest empty table, my hand steadier than I expected. And I walked toward them before I could change my mind, every step feeling louder than it should have against the polished floor. The conversation around them faltered slightly as I approached, and for a second I wondered if I was imagining all of it, if I was about to make a mistake that would cost me everything. But then I saw the wine still dripping from his sleeve and the way no one else had moved to help him, and that was enough. I stopped beside the table and kept my voice low, careful. The way you speak when you are trying not to break something fragile. And I said that we would be happy to replace anything that had been spilled, and that there was no need for anyone to feel uncomfortable. And the man who had been speaking looked up at me like I had interrupted a performance, his expression shifting from amusement to irritation in a second flat. He asked if I knew who I was talking to. The kind of question meant to put someone back in their place, and I felt my pulse jump, but I did not step back. I said that I was just doing my job, that everyone deserved to be treated with respect while they were here. And that was when the table went quiet, not the comfortable kind of quiet but the kind that presses in on you, heavy and expectant. My manager started moving toward us. I could feel it without looking, and I knew what was coming next: the apology, the correction. The moment where I would be reminded exactly where I stood in all of this. But before any of that could happen, I felt it again, that same stillness from earlier, like the air itself had paused, and I glanced at the old man, expecting maybe a nod, maybe a polite dismissal, something ordinary, but instead he was watching me now, really watching me, his eyes sharper up close than they had been from across the room, not grateful, not surprised, just measuring, like he was deciding something I could not hear. And then he spoke for the first time, his voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach the table without forcing it. He said it was all right and that I had done more than enough, and there was something in the way he said it that made the others hesitate, just for a second, like they had stepped onto ground that was not as solid as they thought, and I did not understand why yet, but I could feel it building, slow and quiet, like something waiting just beneath the surface, and I realized then that whatever I had stepped into was not about a spilled drink anymore. The manager reached us before I could say anything else, his polished shoes stopping just a foot away, his presence tight with controlled urgency as he forced a smile that did not reach his eyes and apologized to the table, not to the man sitting quietly with wine soaking into his sleeve but to the ones who had caused it, and I felt the shift immediately, the familiar correction, the quiet reminder that respect in this place was not equal. It was purchased, and I opened my mouth to speak again. But he cut me off with a look that said enough, that said, "Do not make this worse for yourself," and for a second I almost listened, almost stepped back into the role I had practiced so well, invisible, agreeable, safe, but then one of the men laughed again, softer this time, more deliberate, like he knew he had already won, and he said something about how some people needed to be taught where they belonged, and the words hung there, heavy and deliberate, and I felt that same tension coil in my chest, but before it could snap, the old man moved, not abruptly, not in anger, just a small motion as he set the napkin down beside his plate and adjusted his sleeve as if the stain was nothing more than an inconvenience, and when he stood, it was unhurried, measured, like time itself had decided to slow down for him, and suddenly he did not look small anymore, did not look out of place, he looked centered, grounded in a way that made everything around him feel slightly off balance, and I noticed details I had missed before, the way his posture remained perfectly straight despite his age, the way his hands were steady, the faint glint of a watch beneath his cuff that did not match the rest of his worn appearance, understated but precise, and more than that, the way the room seemed to react without understanding why, conversations lowering just a fraction, a few glances shifting toward him and then away again, like instinct had kicked in before logic could catch up, and the man at the table must have felt it too because his smile faltered for just a second before he leaned back again, trying to reclaim control, asking if the old man had something to say, and the silence that followed stretched longer than it should have, long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat, long enough for doubt to creep into the edges of the moment, but then the old man spoke, and his voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it carried in a way that did not require volume. He said that respect was not something you demanded from others, it was something you revealed about yourself, and there was no anger in it, no accusation, just a simple statement that landed heavier than any raised voice could have, and I saw it then. The flicker of uncertainty crossed the faces around the table, subtle but real, like they had stepped into a conversation they no longer fully controlled, and my manager shifted beside me, clearly uncomfortable, glancing toward the entrance as if hoping for a distraction, and that was when it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet sound of the front doors opening, the kind of sound no one usually notices, except this time people did, heads turning one by one, conversations trailing off mid-sentence. And I followed their gaze without thinking, my breath catching as I saw a group of men step inside, dressed in dark suits that fit too perfectly to be accidental, moving with purpose but without rush, their presence cutting through the room in a way that did not need explanation, and one of them looked directly toward us, scanning, assessing, before his expression shifted into something sharper, something respectful, and he started walking in our direction, and I felt it then, clear and undeniable. The moment everything tilted, the moment the balance of the room changed without a single word being raised, and I realized with a certainty that sent a chill through me that whatever came next was not going to be stopped. The man in the suit did not rush, and that was the first thing that made it feel different, because everyone else in that room moved with urgency when something went wrong, servers hurrying, managers stepping in, customers raising their voices to be heard, but he walked like nothing in the world could demand his speed, like the outcome had already been decided before he even took his first step, and as he approached, the subtle details became impossible to ignore. The way people instinctively shifted out of his path without being asked, the way the ambient noise of the restaurant dropped by degrees until even the clink of silverware felt too loud, and I felt my breath slow without meaning to, my focus narrowing to the space between him and the old man who still stood beside the table, calm, unmoved, as if he had been expecting this exact moment all along, and when the suited man finally reached us, he did not look at anyone else first, not the loud group, not the manager, not even me. His eyes went straight to the old man and something changed in his expression instantly. The confidence softened into something else, something controlled but unmistakably respectful, and he gave a small nod, just enough to be seen but not enough to draw attention, and said quietly, "Sir, the car is ready," and the word landed in the air like a shift in gravity, subtle but undeniable, and for a second no one reacted because no one fully understood what it meant yet. But I saw it in the old man's eyes, that same steady focus from before, now paired with something deeper, something that confirmed everything I had been feeling without being able to explain, and he glanced at the man beside him, then back at the table, and for the first time the silence felt heavy for a different reason, not awkward, not uncertain, but expectant, like everyone was waiting for something they could not name, and the man who had been laughing earlier shifted in his seat, his posture losing some of its certainty as he looked between them, trying to read a situation that had slipped out of his control. He asked who exactly they thought they were, his voice louder now, pushing against the quiet like he could force it back into something familiar, but the suited man did not respond, did not even acknowledge him, and that was when it truly changed, not with a threat, not with a raised voice, but with the absence of reaction, the kind that makes a person realize they are no longer the center of the moment, and I felt it ripple outward, the attention of the entire room shifting away from the table and toward the old man, as if something invisible had finally been revealed. And my manager took a small step back, almost unconsciously, his earlier confidence replaced by hesitation, his eyes flicking between the faces in front of him as if trying to recalculate everything he thought he knew, and the old man finally moved again, turning slightly toward the group, his expression unchanged, composed, but now there was something unmistakable beneath it, not anger, not pride, just certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself, and he spoke again, his voice low, steady, carrying effortlessly across the silence as he said that some lessons did not need to be taught loudly, they simply needed to be remembered, and the weight of it settled over the table like something final, and in that moment I understood, not fully, not completely, but enough to feel the shift deep in my chest, enough to know that the man I had stepped forward to defend was never the one who needed saving, and that everyone else in that room was just now beginning to realize it too. The silence did not break all at once, it unraveled slowly, like a thread being pulled from something tightly woven, and I could feel it in the way people shifted in their seats, the way no one quite knew where to look anymore, because the moment had changed and no one had been given permission to react to it yet, and the man who had been laughing earlier tried to recover first, clearing his throat, forcing out a chuckle that sounded thinner now, less certain, as he leaned forward again like he could reclaim control just by pretending nothing had happened, but his eyes kept flicking toward the suited man and then back to the old man, and that hesitation was everything, it said more than any apology ever could, and I watched as the old man reached for the edge of the table, not to steady himself but simply to adjust the placement of a glass that had been knocked slightly off-center, the movement small, precise, deliberate, and somehow that simple action carried more weight than anything else in the room, because it showed he was not reacting to them at all, he was moving within his own space, his own rules, untouched by the noise they had created, and the suited man beside him remained still, hands loosely clasped in front of him, his posture relaxed but alert, like someone waiting for a signal that had already been understood without words, and I realized then that this was not chaos, this was control, quiet and absolute, and the group at the table felt it too, even if they did not fully understand it, because their energy had shifted from loud and careless to something tighter, more cautious, and one of them finally spoke again, but this time his voice lacked the earlier edge. He said there had been a misunderstanding, that things had gotten out of hand, and the words sounded rehearsed even as he spoke them, like he was trying to step backward without admitting he had taken a step forward in the first place, and my manager nodded quickly, eager to agree, to smooth things over, offering complimentary desserts, offering anything that could restore the illusion of normalcy, but the old man did not acknowledge any of it, not the excuses, not the offers, not the sudden politeness that had appeared out of nowhere. He simply looked at them, one by one, his gaze steady, unhurried, and there was something in that look that made them fall silent again, something that did not demand respect but revealed the absence of it, and when he finally spoke, it was not directed at them in anger or even disappointment, it was quieter than that, more final. He said that character was not proven when things were easy, it was revealed when no one believed they were being watched, and the words settled over the table like a mirror none of them wanted to look into. And I felt a strange shift inside me as I stood there, because the tension I had been carrying began to change into something else, something steadier, like understanding was starting to replace fear, and I noticed the way the rest of the room had gone almost completely still now, conversations paused, attention fixed without anyone daring to make it obvious, as if everyone had collectively realized they were witnessing something they did not fully comprehend but instinctively respected, and the old man turned slightly then, not toward the exit yet but toward me, and for a brief second his eyes met mine again, and this time there was something different in them, not just observation but recognition, as if he had taken note of my choice earlier and filed it away somewhere that mattered, and my breath caught without warning, not from fear but from the weight of that acknowledgement, because it felt like standing in front of something vast and unseen, something that had been there all along, hidden beneath the surface of an ordinary night, and I understood then that whatever happened next would not be loud or dramatic. It would be quiet, controlled, and undeniable, just like him. The room did not return to normal after that, it shifted into something quieter, more careful, like everyone had silently agreed to move differently without ever saying it out loud, and I could feel it in the way the servers walked, in the way conversations restarted but never quite reached their previous volume, like a storm had passed through without breaking anything visible but had still changed the air, and the group at the table sat there for a moment longer than they should have. Their earlier confidence drained into something tight and controlled. One of them adjusted his cufflinks with hands that were no longer as steady, another reached for his glass but did not drink, and then, almost all at once, they began to gather their things, not hurried, not panicked, just deliberate, like they understood that staying would only make the moment heavier, and no one stopped them, no one needed to, because whatever had been decided had already been decided without a single command being spoken, and I watched as they left, their voices low, their eyes avoiding the center of the room where the old man still stood, and it struck me then how different silence could feel depending on who held it. Because earlier it had belonged to them, loud and careless, and now it belonged to him, steady and complete, and my manager let out a breath I had not realized he had been holding, straightening his jacket as if trying to pull himself back into authority, but even that felt thinner now, like something borrowed instead of owned, and I remained where I was, unsure if I was supposed to return to my tables or stay, because something about the moment still felt unfinished, like a door that had been opened but not yet closed, and then the old man turned toward the exit at last, his movements smooth, unhurried, as if the entire evening had followed a path only he had seen from the beginning, and the suited man stepped aside slightly to allow him to pass, falling into place beside him without needing direction, and as they walked, the space around them seemed to clear naturally, not out of fear, not exactly, but out of recognition, like people instinctively understood they were in the presence of something they should not interrupt, and just before he reached the door, he paused, not long, just enough to shift his gaze back across the room, and for a second I thought he was looking at the table he had left behind, at the place where everything had started, but then I realized he was looking at me again, and the weight of that attention settled over me in a way that made my chest tighten. Not from fear but from something harder to name, something that felt like being seen in a way I was not used to, and he gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, the kind of gesture most people would miss if they were not looking for it, but I felt it clearly, like a quiet acknowledgement that did not need explanation, and then he turned and continued walking, the doors opening before him as if they had been waiting, and in a matter of seconds he was gone, just another figure disappearing into the night. Except nothing about it felt ordinary, not anymore, because the absence he left behind felt just as heavy as his presence had been, and I stood there for a moment longer, the sounds of the restaurant slowly returning around me, plates clinking, voices rising, life continuing as if nothing had happened, but I knew better, because something had changed, not just in the room but in me, something subtle but permanent, like a line I had crossed without realizing it, and as I picked up my tray again, my hand steadier than before, I could not shake the feeling that this was not the end of the story, it was only the part where I finally understood that I had stepped into something much bigger than a single night. The rest of the night moved forward, but it never truly went back to the way it had been before, and I noticed it in the smallest details, the way customers spoke a little softer, the way my manager checked the entrance more often than usual, like he was expecting something or someone to return, and I tried to focus on my tables, on orders and receipts and the familiar rhythm of work that usually kept my thoughts in place. But it did not hold this time, because every few minutes my mind drifted back to that moment, to the stillness in his voice, to the way the room had shifted without force, and I found myself replaying it again and again, searching for something I had missed, some clue that would make it all make sense, but nothing I knew fit what I had seen, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because I had always believed that power was loud, obvious, something you could recognize immediately. But what I had witnessed was the opposite, quiet, controlled, almost invisible. Until it chose to reveal itself, and the thought stayed with me even as my shift finally ended, the last customers leaving, chairs being turned over onto tables, lights dimming one section at a time until the restaurant felt like a completely different place, empty and echoing where it had once been full, and I changed out of my uniform in the back room, pulling on my jacket as I checked my phone for the time, just past midnight, later than I had planned but not unusual for a double shift, and I told myself I would go home, that I would sleep, that by morning everything would feel smaller, more distant, easier to explain, but even as I stepped out into the cool night air, I knew that was not going to happen, because the feeling followed me, that quiet awareness that something had shifted in a way I could not undo, and I started walking toward the bus stop at the corner, the street mostly empty now except for the occasional car passing by, the city settling into that late-night calm that always felt a little unreal, like a pause between scenes, and I was halfway there when I noticed it, not something obvious, just a subtle change in the way the street felt, like I was being observed without knowing from where, and my steps slowed slightly, my senses sharpening without my permission, and that was when I heard it, the low hum of an engine pulling up behind me, not fast, not aggressive, just controlled, deliberate, and I turned before I could stop myself, my breath catching as I saw the car, black, polished, the kind that did not belong on a quiet street like this unless it had a reason, and the rear window lowered smoothly, revealing a familiar figure inside, and for a second everything else faded again, just like it had in the restaurant, the noise, the distance, the space between us, all of it gone as his eyes met mine once more, steady, unreadable, and yet unmistakably focused, and he did not speak right away, did not rush the moment, as if he understood exactly how much weight it already carried, and when he finally did, his voice was as calm as before, unchanged by everything that had happened, and he said that I had made a choice earlier, a simple one, but not an easy one, and that choices like that had consequences most people did not see coming, and I felt my pulse quicken, not from fear but from the realization that this was not a coincidence, that nothing about this encounter was accidental, and I stood there, caught between the instinct to step back and the quiet pull that kept me where I was, listening, waiting, knowing without being told that whatever came next was going to matter far more than anything that had already happened. For a moment I did not move, not forward, not back, just stood there with the cool night air brushing against my skin and the quiet hum of the engine filling the space between us, because something in the way he spoke made it clear that this was not a conversation you rushed into or out of, it was something you stepped into carefully, and I realized then that he was giving me that choice again, not with words but with silence, and I swallowed, steadying my voice before I answered that I had only done what anyone should have done, that it was not a choice, it was just right. And as soon as I said it I wondered if that sounded naive, if it revealed more about me than I intended. But he did not smile, did not dismiss it, instead his gaze sharpened slightly, like he was measuring the weight of those words rather than the simplicity of them, and he said that most people believed that until the cost became clear, until doing the right thing meant losing something they could not afford to lose, and the way he said it made it feel less like a warning and more like a truth he had seen too many times to doubt, and I felt that same quiet tension return, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that makes you realize you are standing at the edge of something without knowing how far it goes, and I asked what kind of consequences he meant, my voice softer now, more careful, and he did not answer right away. Instead he glanced briefly toward the street, as if acknowledging something unseen, and I followed his gaze without understanding, noticing another car parked further down, still, silent. And then he looked back at me and said that attention had a way of finding people who stood out, especially in places where most preferred to stay invisible, and that once you were seen, you could not simply return to being unnoticed, and the word settled into me slowly, like something I already knew but had never put into words, because I had felt it earlier, in the restaurant, in the way the room had shifted, in the way his presence had changed everything without effort, and I realized he was not just talking about himself, he was talking about me now, about what it meant to step forward when no one else did, and I felt a flicker of doubt then, a quiet question rising in the back of my mind about whether I would have acted the same way if I had known who he was, if I had understood the weight behind that moment. But before I could answer it, he spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost reflective, and he said that courage was not about knowing the outcome, it was about acting before you did, and something in that shifted the doubt into something steadier, something closer to understanding, and I felt my shoulders relax just slightly, my breath evening out as I met his gaze again without looking away, and for a second the distance between us felt smaller, not physically but in a way that made the moment feel less like an encounter and more like a conversation that had been waiting to happen, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the movement smooth, unhurried, and withdrew a small card, holding it between his fingers for a second before extending it toward me, and I hesitated only briefly before taking it, the paper heavier than I expected, the edges precise, and I glanced down to see a name printed in clean, simple lettering. Victor Moretti, nothing more, no title, no explanation, but somehow it carried more meaning than anything else he could have said, and when I looked back up at him, he was already watching me, as if he knew exactly what that name would mean once I understood it, and he said that if the consequences of my choice ever found me, I would not have to face them alone, and there was no demand in it, no expectation, just a quiet offer that felt more significant than it sounded, and before I could respond, the window began to rise again, smooth and final, the barrier returning between us as the car prepared to move, and I stood there with the card in my hand, the weight of it settling in slowly as the vehicle pulled away into the night, leaving behind the same quiet street but not the same sense of certainty, because I knew now that whatever I had stepped into was not something that ended when the moment passed. It was something that stayed, something that waited, just like him. I did not move for a long time after the car disappeared, not because I was frozen but because something inside me was trying to catch up to what had just happened, like my mind was still standing in that space between choice and consequence, and the street felt different now, quieter in a way that was no longer empty but aware, and I looked down at the card in my hand again, tracing the clean lettering with my thumb as if it might reveal something more if I focused hard enough, but it did not need to, because I already understood what it represented, not just a name but a door, one that had been opened without force, without pressure, simply offered, and I realized then that the real weight of the night was not in the moment inside the restaurant or even in the quiet authority he carried, it was in the fact that he had seen me, truly seen me, and decided I was worth remembering, and that thought stayed with me as I finally started walking again, slower this time, more aware of each step, of each passing second, as if the world had shifted slightly and I was only just learning how to move within it. And the bus ride home felt longer than usual, the city lights reflecting against the window as I watched them blur past, my reflection faintly visible over them, and for the first time in a long while I did not look away from it, I studied it, searching for the person who had stepped forward earlier that night and wondering if she had always been there or if something had changed in that moment, and I thought about his words, about choices and consequences and the way attention finds those who stand out, and I understood now that it was not a threat, it was a truth, one that most people avoided by staying quiet, by blending in, by choosing safety over integrity, and I could not say with certainty that I would always make the same choice again, But I knew that tonight I had, and that was something that could not be undone or ignored, and when I finally reached my apartment, the familiar creak of the door and the quiet stillness inside felt almost distant, like a place I had left behind even though I was standing right in it, and I set the card down on the small table by the window, staring at it for a moment before turning away, not because I wanted to forget it but because I knew I would not, and as I lay in bed later, the ceiling above me fading into darkness, I replayed everything one last time, the laughter, the silence, the shift, the look in his eyes, and I realized that power had never been what I thought it was not loud or obvious or demanding, it did not need to prove itself to anyone, it simply existed, waiting for the moment it chose to be revealed, and that night, I had not just witnessed it, I had stepped into its path, and whether I liked it or not, it had noticed me. And as sleep finally pulled me under, one thought stayed with me, quiet but certain, that some nights do not end when you close your eyes, they begin there, and I had the feeling that this was only the beginning.